This is True Crime Out Loud.
I'm your host, B.
And I'm your host, Jen. And the case this week was recommended by Jess Hughes from Terre Haute, Indiana. And I want to thank Jess personally that she referred to us as Jen and Salty B, because that means I'm not the only one who realizes my co-host is salty.
This week's case is going to be on the Lindbergh baby. As Jen mentioned, it's at Jess's request. And when I initially heard about this, I thought, Lindbergh baby, we just did Charles Manson. We try to keep a good balance of stuff people have heard of versus stuff people haven't heard of. But we found out some stuff that was very interesting on this case and some stuff that I didn't know. So jump in there with us and maybe we can tell you something you didn't already know about this case, because there are a lot of different aspects of it. And the Lindbergh baby case centers around Hopewell Township, New Jersey, with a land area of almost 60 square miles and a current day population of 18,000. But as I'm sure you're all aware, the Lindbergh baby case took place in the 1930s, 1932 in fact, and the population was just below 4,000 at that time. In 1932, the Lindberghs were building an estate home in a remote area near Hopewell Township, New Jersey, and while the home was being built, they were staying at another home in Englewood. They would only spend weekends at the Hopewell home because it was still under construction and it wasn't completely ready to be lived in. So who are the Lindberghs? And I know we may be reviewing some stuff for listeners out there, but obviously Charles Augustus Lindbergh was an American aviator, military officer, and inventor. And he went by nicknames such as the Lone Eagle and his most famous nickname, Lucky Lindy. He's best known for flights in a plane named the Spirit of St. Louis. On May 20th, 1927, at the age of 25, Charles took off from New York in the Spirit of St. Louis and made a 3,600-mile flight to Paris, lasting 33 and a half hours. And that was the first solo, non-stop transatlantic flight. And that's crazy because while 1927 is a long time ago, it's still not that long ago. And think about how many transatlantic flights happen every day now. But this was the first, and he became an instant world hero. And the prize money for this flight was $25,000, which, figuring in inflation, would be about $400,000 in today's money. The whole country was enthralled with this flight, and even President Coolidge sent the USS Memphis to bring Charles and the Spirit of St. Louis back home. He had a big welcome home ceremony at the base of the Washington Monument, and 250,000 people attended. He was also awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross by President Coolidge. And like I said, this flight makes him instantly famous, and so he goes on a tour across the U.S., known as a goodwill tour, and it also went into Mexico. And this was in 1927 after the flight, and this is where he met his wife, Anne Morrow, in December of 1927. Anne was the daughter of an American ambassador named Dwight Morrow, and Charles and Anne were married on May 27th, 1929. The Spirit of St. Louis, the airplane that he completed the flight in, was given to the Smithsonian Institute in 1928, and you can actually go see it. It is currently on display in the National Air and Space Museum. Charles eventually authored an autobiography titled We, which was a bestseller, and he wrote articles on aviation for the New York Times. Anne also became a best-selling author, and her first work was North to the Orient. Anne, in fact, also earned a pilot's license, so they had similar interests in writing and piloting. Charles and Anne had their first child, Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr., on June 22nd, 1930. That is Anne's 24th birthday, which I think is pretty neat. It's worth mentioning, little known fact, Salty B has the same birthday as his dad, so how about that? They called Charles Jr. Charlie. And obviously the whole Lindbergh family are rock stars of their day. They have celebrity status for the 1930s.
The case began on Tuesday, March 1st, 1932. The Lindbergh family was staying at their estate in Hopewell, New Jersey. Now, this was out of the norm for them to be there on a Tuesday because they usually only stayed there weekends. But Charlie had a cold and Anne didn't want to get him out and travel. And she decided on that day about 10:30 a.m. that they would be staying at Hopewell. Charles was supposed to be in New York for a speaking event, but he had inadvertently missed it, and he later said he just forgot about it. Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr., who was 20 months old, he's also sometimes referred to as Charles Lindbergh III, but I want to make a correction on this. His father was Charles Augustus Lindbergh Sr., and his grandfather was named Charles August Lindbergh. So Charlie was not the third, he was a junior. On March 1st, 1932, around 9 p.m., Charlie was kidnapped from his crib in the nursery on the second floor of the Lindbergh home. Around 10 p.m., the baby's nurse, Betty Gow, went to check on the infant and found his crib empty. So she immediately notifies Mr. and Miss Lindbergh that she can't find the baby. And they were in the home in a different area along with some of the other staff. So the parents and all of the staff searched the home for any signs of this child. But Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. was gone. He was described as 20 months old, curly blonde hair, 27 to 30 pounds, dark blue eyes, 29 inches tall, and a light complexion. No one had heard Charlie cry out, and they had no idea where he could be. So they do as anybody else would do. They call the police, and the police respond. And when they get there, they found a ransom note on the windowsill. The note demanded $50,000, which in today's money would be about $1 million. They said specifically there should be $25,000 in $20 bills, $15,000 in $10 bills, and $10,000 in $5 bills. This was to be delivered in 2 to 4 days, and it said they would inform of where to deliver the money. It also said, "We warn you for making anything public or for notifying the police. The child is in good care." But Hopewell police are still notified, and they call New Jersey State Police, who take over the investigation. Also in the home, the police found traces of mud on the floor of the nursery and footprints under the nursery window. But they were unable to determine anything, even the size of the shoe, from these footprints. There were also 2 sections of ladder located on the property. This ladder was presumed to be used to reach the baby's window as it didn't belong to the Lindberghs. This ladder had split where it joined 2 ladder sections, so it was damaged. The window of the nursery had a shutter that was warped, so it would not close, allowing access in through that window. Police believe that the ladder broke during the kidnapper either going up or coming down, but most likely they believe it broke when he was coming back down with the baby. There were no bloodstains or fingerprints in or around the nursery. So police investigate and they question all of the household and estate employees and even the parents themselves. The garage of the Lindbergh estate became the command center and headquarters for the search for Charlie. Charles Sr. asked friends to communicate with the kidnappers, so his friends began to reach out widespread to try to reach these kidnappers and start negotiations. And when we say friends, remember, Charles Sr. is very, very famous, so he has some very high-reaching friends. Charles also inserted himself into the investigation, and he used his celebrity status and influence to basically head up this investigation. There were many tips and clues that were investigated, but nothing was fruitful and all leads were exhausted. The police even communicated with known criminals to try to find who these kidnappers could be, but again, it led to nothing. And then on March 6, 1932, a second ransom note was received by Charles Sr. It was postmarked from Brooklyn, New York, dated March the 4th. This letter increased the ransom to $70,000.
So on March 8th, they receive again another ransom note, and this time it was received by the Lindbergh family attorney saying that an intermediary appointed by the Lindberghs would not be accepted, and they requested a note in the newspaper. On the same day, Dr. John F. Condon, who was from the Bronx in New York, he published in the Bronx Home News an offer that he would act as the go-between, and he would pay an additional $1,000 in ransom money. Dr. Condon was a respected retired school principal, and they received a fourth note later on that, in fact, Dr. Condon would be an acceptable go-between, and Charles Sr. approved this. On March 10th, 1932, Dr. Condon received $70,000 in cash for the ransom payment and began negotiations with kidnappers through the newspaper, and he used a code name, Jafsie, Jafsie. Not sure where that came about. On March 12th at about 8:30 p.m., Condon received an anonymous call. Then he receives another note delivered by Joseph Perrone, who was a taxi cab driver. Perrone said that he received the note from a stranger who just walked up and paid him to deliver it. This note provided another clue. It said that another note could be found beneath a stone at a vacant stand about 100 feet from an outlying subway station. So Condon proceeds to that location and finds the next note. This note was for Condon to meet with an unidentified man at the Woodlawn Cemetery near 233rd Street and Jerome Avenue. So Condon had a bodyguard with him, but during this interaction in the Woodlawn Cemetery, he met without the bodyguard, and he met with an unidentified man. And when I say unidentified, we don't know exactly who he is, but he referred to himself as John. The men discussed payment of the ransom, and John said he would furnish something to confirm that he had the child. So they leave that meeting, and there's no firm plans in place. And Condon continues to run ads in the newspapers telling the kidnappers, hey, we met, we will still pay the ransom, we just need you to contact us. And on March 16th, Condon receives a note and the baby's sleeping unit. Charles Sr. identified these clothes as belonging to his missing son. On March 21st, Condon receives yet another note. This note said that the kidnappers were insisting on full compliance, that this was a well-planned crime. They had been planning it for a year, and for them to not try anything. On March 29th, Betty Gow, if you'll remember that's who Jen mentioned was the baby's nurse, she found the thumb guard of Charles Jr. near the entrance of the estate. And she knew that he had been wearing this at the time of the kidnapping. And a thumb guard is just a thing that went over his thumb to prevent him from sucking his thumb. On March the 30th, Condon receives the next note, and it was more threatening in nature and threatened to increase the ransom to $100,000. On April 1st, a month after the kidnapping, so 30 days have gone by, we still don't have this child back, but we receive another note. Condon does. The note told him to have the money ready for the next night. And Condon replied to this by putting an ad in the press and letting the kidnappers know that he was ready. On April 2nd, Condon again receives another note from another taxi cab driver who said he had been paid by a stranger to give the note. And Condon gets sent on another note-to-note wild goose chase. Condon follows the instructions and goes to a greenhouse at 3225 East Tremont Avenue in the Bronx, where he found another note under a stone in the greenhouse. This note told Condon to again meet with John, the person he had met in the cemetery. The two men met. John agreed to reduce the ransom to $50,000. And so Condon gives him the money. I guess he's been lugging the money around on all this all over the place stuff. Dr. Condon is given a receipt and another note, and then John just kind of walks away into the wooded area of this park where they met. This final note given to Dr. Condon told where Charles Jr. could be found. It was said that he was near Martha's Vineyard on a boat named Nellie. Police immediately begin searching the Martha's Vineyard area, but can't find a boat named Nellie. Nellie was never located, and they did not get Charlie back as a result of paying their ransom.
But there's more to the story. On May 12th, 1932, now this is a little over 2 months after Charlie had been kidnapped, about 4.5 miles from the Lindbergh estate, the body of a small child, toddler, is found, partially buried and badly decomposed. William Allen, who was an assistant on a truck, accidentally stumbled across this body. And the body was identified by Charles Lindbergh and Betty Gow, the nurse. It was that of Charles Jr. He had overlapping toes on his feet, and they were still visible. And then there were some shreds of clothing that were worn by Charlie that they used to help identify him. His head was crushed, and there was a hole in his skull. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. Some parts of his body were missing, and this is most likely due to animal activity and decomposition. The child had been dead for about 2 months. He most likely died the night he was kidnapped. He was cremated the day after his body was found. Charlie also had some other issues that were noted. His fontanelle, the soft spot on a baby's head, was not closed, and by 20 months, it should have been almost all the way closed. He had mild rickets and had to take vitamin D daily, and it was a very mild case of this. There was no evidence of any major medical problems, which is something that comes up in several theories that people present, that Charlie had all these medical problems, but that was not the case. The governor called a police conference with law enforcement, prosecutors, where they discussed theories, evidence, and possible procedures. Charles Sr. even hired his own private investigator. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover said the FBI would provide assistance along with the superintendent of the New Jersey State Police, Colonel Schwarzkopf.
And a side note about Colonel Schwarzkopf is that he is the father of General Norman Schwarzkopf, who was obviously the leader of the U.S. forces in the Gulf War.
By May of 1932, the president directed the FBI to serve as the coordinating agency for the investigation. In late May of 1932, the FBI in the New York office informed banks in the greater New York area to keep a close watch for the ransom money. And they did this because the FBI had created a list with all the serial numbers of the ransom gold certificates, and this was given to banks, grocery stores, gas stations, airports, department stores, post offices, and telegraph companies. And later that month, the New Jersey State Police offered up to a $25,000 reward for information in the apprehension and conviction of the kidnapper or kidnappers. And while the police are still investigating after Charlie has been found, his body's been located, on June 10th of 1932, they go back to question Violet Sharpe. And Violet was a servant in the home of Mrs. Dwight Morrow. So this was Anne Lindbergh's mother's home. Violet had already been questioned a few times about any information or relation to the kidnapping. And she was going to be questioned again. But she ran upstairs in the home and drank silver polish, which contained potassium cyanide. So she died fairly quick. She had given some contradictory statements, but her activity on the night of the kidnapping had been examined, and there was no connection found to the kidnapping. There are several theories as to why Violet Sharpe killed herself, including to keep from admitting that she had been cheating on her fiancé, and another theory is because she might have provided information to someone who called the home wanting to know the whereabouts of the Lindberghs on the night of the kidnapping, and she didn't know this was the kidnapper but gave that information. But none of this has been proven.
So we don't have much to go on. The police don't, right? They've got the ransom money that's out there in circulation that they haven't gotten back yet. And they've got the physical evidence that they collected at the scene. And they got some notes and stuff. And in total, the kidnapper wrote 15 notes. Experts felt that all of those notes were written by the same person and possibly someone of German nationality, but someone who had spent time in America. Letters 7 and 8 were tested for fingerprints with silver nitrate, but they didn't locate anything. Another crucial piece of evidence was the ladder. The ladder was homemade, and experts said that it was built by somebody very familiar with wood and mechanically inclined, possibly trained in carpentry or had a carpentry work history. And it was crudely built, but it was really well designed. It was a homemade ladder, as I mentioned, and it came in 3 sections, and it used pins to lock each piece together, which is interesting because at the time, an expandable ladder is a pretty common thing today. We get them made out of aluminum. They're not even that heavy, and you can shrink them down so they're easier to carry and then expand them out to get to a higher place. Well, this person made that on their own when most of the ladders of the time would have been a fixed height and they wouldn't have been able to expand or contract. Each of the sections nestled in each other to make them smaller, much like our ladders today, and that made the ladder easier for the kidnapper to carry. The ladder itself was examined for fingerprints and shown to other people, but no fingerprints were found on it, and no one recognized the ladder as something that they had seen before. Wood expert Arthur Kohler, who worked for the U.S. Department of Agriculture and Forest Service, was brought in to examine the ladder in 1933. And he looked at all of the wood and slivers of wood, and he completely disassembled the ladder, identified all of the types of wood used and any tool marks. And he was able to see some unique patterns made by nail holes. He felt that some of the wood had already been used and had been repurposed to build the ladder. And he said that this wood had most likely been used in indoor construction prior to being repurposed to build this ladder. The other clue that the FBI had was Dr. Condon's face-to-face interactions with this man known as John. And what they did is they had him write down the conversations, basically create a transcript of it, and then they recorded Dr. Condon attempting to imitate John's dialect and the way he pronounced things so that they could kind of get an idea possibly of the nationality of the person that they were dealing with. So what happens to the ransom money? Because we know that the FBI's got the serial numbers written down. We know that's a good clue, right? Well, on May 2nd, 1933, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York actually discovered 296 $10 gold certificates and one $20 gold certificate that were all on the ransom list. This money had been received by the bank on May 1st. So they track down the deposit ticket and they find that this deposit was made by J.J. Faulkner, who resided at 537 West 149th Street, and that the total amount of the deposit was $2,980. Well, so they go to track this guy down, but they're never able to locate J.J. Faulkner. So then we have a weird turn of events because in 1933, because of the Great Depression, an executive order was issued for all gold certificates to be returned to the Treasury. About $40,000 of the ransom money was in the form of gold certificates, and it was said that this was done on purpose. When they were compiling the ransom money, they knew that gold certificates, we were moving away from the gold standard. The Great Depression is what pushed us over the edge, but we were moving away from the gold standard, and so they kind of figured that these certificates could catch people's eye at a later time. And on October 19th, 1933, the FBI officially announced that they would have exclusive jurisdiction in the case, and that ended the New Jersey State Police's involvement. August 20th, 1934 through September 16th of 1934, during this time period, there were 16 more gold certificates that surfaced in New York, mostly in Yorkville and Harlem. The banks discovered these certificates close to the time when they were passed, and so they were able to trace them back to where it was presented and get descriptions of the people using the money. They were mostly passed at produce stores, and the descriptions seemed to be all of the same person, and this person matched the description that Dr. Condon had given of John. On September 18th, 1934, at about 1:20 p.m., the Corn Exchange Bank and Trust Company, located at 125th Street and Park Avenue, notified the FBI that they had found a $10 gold certificate which had come from a gas station at 127th Street and Lexington Avenue. The attendant had received the bill from a customer on September 15th for the purchase of 5 gallons of gas, and the man fit the description of John. Now here's where they catch their big break. The attendant said that because all the gold certificates had been recalled, the fact that this guy paid with a gold certificate, it's still legal tender, kind of like a $2 bill today. But it's odd, right? If we see a $2 bill, it's like, oh, $2 bill. Well, same thing with this guy. He knows that we're off the gold standard, so this gold certificate that he's paying, that he receives for gas, kind of catches his eye. And he thought it was odd. And he thought that the bank may not take it because we were moving off of the gold standard. So he jots the license plate number down of the vehicle that the man was driving on the edge of the gold certificate. Incredible stroke of luck for the police. This guy's afraid that his gold certificate isn't going to be accepted by the bank. He's afraid he may have to track this guy down at a later date for a gas drive off, I guess you would say. So he writes the plate number down. So the license plate returned to Bruno Richard Hauptmann of 1279 East 222nd Street in Bronx, New York. And so the FBI thinks they've got their man now, and they're going to set up on his house, and they do so on September 18th and begin surveilling his house. And the next morning, they see a man leaving around 9 a.m., and they wait until he gets to his vehicle, and then they spring the trap and take him into custody.
So who is Bruno Richard Hauptmann? He was a 35-year-old German man who had been in the U.S. about 11 years. When he was taken into custody, he had a $20 gold certificate in his possession that returned to be some of the ransom money. Hauptmann was a carpenter. They searched his home, and they found some very convincing evidence. They found a pair of shoes they knew had been bought with the ransom money. Hauptmann even admitted to several other purchases that matched up with recovered ransom money. His Dodge sedan fit the description of a vehicle seen in the area of the Lindbergh estate the day before the kidnapping. But hidden in Hauptmann's garage, in the frame of the wall, was $13,000 in ransom money. But it gets even better. In the attic, they found a floorboard that had been sawn in half that matched perfectly with the wood used to make the ladder used in the kidnapping. They discover several other things about Hauptmann. He had a criminal history in Germany where he spent time in prison. The criminal history involved him using a ladder to climb into the second story of the mayor's home, where he stole money and watches. Another incident was a robbery that he did with someone else, where they held up a woman at gunpoint, and this woman was pushing a baby carriage. In 1923, he stowed away on the SS Hanover in Bremen, Germany, and he arrived at the port of New York on July 13th, 1923. But he was caught, he was arrested, and he was deported. He tried the same thing in August, but this attempt also failed. But in November of 1923, he decided to try again on the George Washington and was successful in entering the U.S. 2 years later, he married Anna Schofler, who was a waitress in New York, and they eventually had a son. Hauptmann had worked as a carpenter up until the spring of 1932. So let's think back. Charlie was kidnapped March 1st, 1932. Beginning in March of 1932, Hauptmann began to trade a good bit in stocks, and he didn't work again as a carpenter. Hauptmann's defense? He received this box with the gold certificates from a friend who told him to hold it for him. He said he originally didn't know what was in the box, but once he found out what it contained, he started spending the money. He was holding the money for his business partner, Isidore Fish. And Isidore had actually died a few months before Hauptmann was arrested. He said Fish owed him $7,000, so he should be able to spend some of that money. But on September 26 of 1934, he was indicted for extortion in Bronx County, New York. October 8th of 1934, he was indicted for murder in Hunterdon County, New Jersey. And he was sent to New Jersey in mid-October of that year to stand trial.
So this was the trial of the century. This is obviously way before what we would probably consider the trial of the century, the O.J. Simpson trial maybe. But this was what had everybody talking at the time. This really was the trial of the century, and it began on January 3rd of 1935 in Flemington, New Jersey. And the trial itself lasted 5 weeks. But during the trial, the prosecution offered Hauptmann a deal. See, they didn't think that he could pull this off by himself, and they thought that he had accomplices, and they wanted to know who those accomplices were. And in fact, they told Hauptmann that they would take the death penalty off the table if he would turn in these accomplices. Hauptmann didn't take the deal. He said that he was innocent and couldn't name any accomplices because he didn't know who did it. In court, witnesses testified that tool marks on the ladder matched the tools owned by Hauptmann. Wood in the attic flooring of his home matched the wood used to build the makeshift expandable ladder. Dr. Condon's phone number and address were written on the door frame inside of a closet in his home. Experts said that the notes were all written by the same person and that handwriting was that of Hauptmann. And what they did is they had Hauptmann submit basically forced writing samples. Hauptmann was identified by Joseph Perrone as the man who gave him the note to take Dr. Condon. If you'll remember, this is the first taxi cab driver who delivered one of the ransom notes, and he identified him. He was also identified by Dr. Condon as the man that he met who went by the name John. So the evidence is stacking up against him. And on February 13th, 1935, Hauptmann is found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. He appeals this conviction to the Supreme Court of New Jersey and then to the U.S. Supreme Court, but his final denial was in December of 1935. And on April 3rd, 1936, at 8:47 p.m., he was put to death by electrocution, which was common for the time. His wife, Anna, maintained her husband's innocence all the way up until her death in 1994.
But we got some more information for you. After Charlie was kidnapped and was found murdered, Charles Lindbergh and Anne had other children. 1932, they had John. 1937, they had Land. 1940, they had Anne. 1942, they had Scott. In 1945, they had Reeve. And in 1974, after all these kids are grown, Charles Lindbergh died. Anne Morrow went on to live a good while longer, and she died in 2001. But there's even more to this story, and things that really aren't known by everybody. But Charles Lindbergh had a secret life. Charles obviously traveled a good bit. He was flying everywhere, and he made trips to Germany. After Charles Lindbergh died, things came to light about these travels to Germany and his private life. Charles had a secret girlfriend, a German woman named Bridget Hessheimer, who was a hat maker. Their relationship began in 1957 when Charles was 55 and Bridget was 31. And this relationship continued almost 20 years until Charles died in 1974. But with Bridget, he fathered 3 children, Dirk, Astrid, and David. This relationship was kept a secret, and even from the children that Charles and Bridget had together. They didn't know that Charles Lindbergh was their father. But Charles actually did visit them several times a year, but the kids knew him as a man named Corot Kent. When they got a little older, one of the children suspected the true identity of Corot Kent and confronted their mother, where she admitted the identity of their father and said it was Charles Lindbergh. It was after Bridget's death that the children went public with being the biological children of Charles Lindbergh. But that's not all. Charles also had a relationship with Bridget's sister, Marietta, and with her, he had 2 children. It's also suspected he had 2 children with his German translator and personal secretary, Valeska. 10 days before he died, Charles wrote letters to these women and told them to always keep their secret. The children of Bridget verified their suspicions of their real father through DNA, and this was, again, after their mother's death. So it was confirmed that they were the biological children of Charles Lindbergh. But these children weren't doing this for money. They didn't make a claim for any of the Lindbergh estate. But they did write a book titled The Double Life of Charles A. Lindbergh.
So, wow, sounds like he got around with women like he got around the world in his airplane. Whew. But what happens at the end of all of this? Well, there are some things that come as a result of this case. The kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby created the Lindbergh Law, which was also known as the Federal Kidnapping Act, and it was passed by the 72nd Congress. This made kidnapping a federal crime and gave jurisdiction to the FBI. The law was passed on June 17, 1932. The Lindbergh estate, where this crime had taken place, it was built on 380 acres and had been dubbed Highfields by Anne Lindbergh. But after the body was found, they left the home and never returned. It was eventually turned into a rehabilitation center for youth in 1952 and is currently owned by the New Jersey Department of Corrections. It's still actually there. The Lindberghs left the U.S. from 1935 until 1939, I guess to get out of the limelight, and retreated to Europe. They just didn't want this attention associated with their child's kidnapping and death.
So that's the end of the Charles Lindbergh kidnapping case. Now it's time for discussion, and I've got a few things I want to discuss. So Hauptmann and the theories. There's a lot of theories, including that Charles Lindbergh himself was involved. And some of the things that are said was, Charles Lindbergh tried to direct this investigation. But my opinion, I don't think this had to do with him being involved in the kidnapping and death of his child. He was obviously a type A personality, and I think that he just felt like he was smarter than all of these policemen, and he wanted to make sure things were done right, and he wanted to have control of it.
And I think that's probably a good read into the situation. I mean, he is a type A personality, and he's used to being in control. I mean, he's the pilot of his own airplane, and he is famous for solo flights. So he wasn't really working with somebody. He is, I guess, to this point, been in charge of his own destiny and probably felt like he could take control of this situation. He probably also figured that if he had a prominent spot in the investigation, that might aid in the recovery of his child, I guess simply because he is famous.
I'm glad you agree with me. The next thing was Hauptmann's involvement, and that's where you see the biggest variety of different theories. And the 3 of them are that there was more than one kidnapper. It was Hauptmann and some other people. Another theory is that Hauptmann was not involved at all, but just got blamed for it. The third part of that could be that Hauptmann did it and he did it alone. But let's go back to the more than one kidnapper. I want to start there. First of all, do you think Hauptmann was involved?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Do you think that somebody else was involved with him?
I do. I think this is too complicated for one guy to pull off. I mean, it's possible, but I think it's it's too intricate. All these notes being passed, and even if he writes all the notes himself, the handwriting examiner said that it matched his handwriting and everything. But even if he writes all the notes by himself, and I mean, this is a complicated crime that probably required surveillance of the Lindbergh home and that kind of thing. I just think it's more than a one-person job.
Well, things that point to that, and it's been pointed out several different blogs and documentaries that you see, is that Hauptmann had what, $14,000 of the money. He had spent a little bit of that, but that leaves another $37,000. And where would that have gone if it wasn't split with other people? And I guess that can point to, yeah, there were other people involved, but you could also say, hey, devil's advocate, he hid the rest of the money somewhere. That's just what he had in his home.
Yeah, but if he's going to hide 13 or 14 grand of the money in his home, I mean, I don't know. I guess the 36 or 37 could have been buried in the backyard and they just never found it, but I don't personally believe that. And his weak story about fish and the money belonging to fish, and so I'm just storing this for my buddy. I mean, how many times have we heard that? I'm just holding this for a friend. And is that true or is it not?
Well, that kind of leads us to the next part of that, where Hauptmann not being involved at all, because the money was spent around the time that Fish would have died. So he's holding this money. He doesn't spend any of it. Fish dies, and then he starts spending the money. So if he was holding the money for a friend, hey, I got this money nobody knows about, I'm going to start spending it, is one thing that can lead you to that Hauptmann not being involved at all. I don't think there's much else that leads you or leads me to believe that he wasn't involved. There's just too much there.
That's what I was going to say. There's too many other things that can't just be written off as coincidence. Now, I know that each individual piece of evidence, like the floorboard piece that was used to build the ladder, well, people have contested that the match to the other floorboard in the house wasn't perfect, and, it may not have been, but there's no denying that Hauptmann had the technical skill to build the ladder, all right? And it was, like I said, it sounds so mundane, an expanding ladder, but police were like, hey, this is a guy with some technical skill, right? Because it's not something that just existed at the time. Hauptmann definitely had that skill. Hauptmann had a history of perpetrating like crimes. He uses a ladder to go into the mayor's house and steal some stuff, and then has another involvement with a kid and that kind of thing. It's just too much to be a coincidence. Hauptmann's definitely involved, and, I might go so far as to say the ringleader of it, but I just think that he had to have somebody else helping him.
Well, let's cover the third part of that Hauptmann did it alone. And you're going to give me skank eyes or stink eyes, whatever you call it. When I say this, I think he could have done it alone. I mean, think about it. He said this had been planned for a year. He very well could have been planning it for a year. Charlie was 20 months old, so he might have thought once Charlie was born, hey, I'm going to plan to kidnap the Lindbergh child. And things just lined up. I mean, he was able to do surveillance. He was able to build that ladder. I mean, he could have gone in that nursery window, got the child out, come down the ladder, take him off to where he did and killed him, and then written these ransom notes, showed up to get the ransom money. I mean, he had all the evidence that they have points to him. What other evidence do they have other than he didn't have all the money? What other evidence points to anyone else that they can connect to anyone else?
Well, they recover gold certificates that aren't directly linked to him. I mean, those are showing up all over New York City, right? So those could have been passed by other people. I mean, and here's my thing. It's not impossible. All right. We've already said that his workload would be great, writing all these notes and the planning and all that. And I'll grant you that it's not impossible. So statistically, kidnapping could be a solo crime, especially kidnapping of a random person. But I don't know about a high-profile kidnapping. You look at some other high-profile kidnappings like Patty Hearst case. I mean, that was a group of people, whole different thing that maybe we'll cover one day. It's a different when you go after a high-profile target, okay? So this would be the modern-day equivalent of kidnapping, I don't know, Denzel Washington's kid. How easy do you think it would be to get to, or a movie, any or sports figure. How easy would it be to get to Tom Brady's kid? Okay, because that's who Charles Lindbergh was at the time. And I think that Hauptmann, if he had any kind of plan, this intricate plan, he's going to lay out this whole intricate plan by himself, yet he's going to go to a house where he knows there's more people there than just the Lindbergh baby and the parents, which could be a problem anyway if he's discovered while he's taking the child. But he knows there's servants there. He knows there's other people on the property. I mean, he knows all these things. Is he going to risk being able to do that without the assistance of a lookout or an assistant? Or, I mean, boy, that sure is your plan that you've made for a year. Your intricate plan that you've made for a year sure is relying on a lot of luck the day of the big show if we're going to go in there by ourselves. What happens if a maid walks in and sees him? Well, you know, I mean, he could be, I don't know how many people on the property at the time. 4, 5, 6. I mean, we had several servants. Like I said, this would be like walking into a superstar's home today and pulling off this type of crime.
I don't think that's even equivalent. I mean, now you have camera systems, alarm systems, you have people with bodyguards. You don't leave windows open like you used to. I don't think it's as complicated as you're saying it would be. It's complicated, but not as it would be today. And Denzel, I mean, where did that come from?
Well, I'm just saying somebody important, you know, somebody famous. Like I said, Denzel Washington, Tom Brady, you name the famous guy. Okay. And I realize that technology is much more advanced today. So you would have camera systems and everything, but everybody says that there was a lot of people on scene at the house when the child was discovered missing. You got to assume that they had servants there. Man, I don't know that Tom Brady has a personal cook, but I bet Charles Lindbergh did. What if the cook walks in while he's taking the baby? Or
why is the cook going to walk in at 9 or 10 o'clock at night?
But you see what I'm saying. Maybe they hear rustling around in the yard. Back then, it was a lot more common for the assistants to live on the property.
Well, and he could have had a gun. I mean, if he planned for it, he would have had a gun with him. They did find a gun in his home. So he could have taken a gun with him to handle any of those problems that came up.
That's still, like I said, hey, if he chose to do it that way, he had a pretty intricate plan that he relied on a lot of luck. And I guess it worked, kinda, because they said that maybe, you know, one of the prevailing theories is that the ladder broke while he's holding the kid and he fell down, and that's where the kid sustained the injuries, and that kind of changes the plan. Well, I mean, if he's by himself, that's a shoddy plan, right? What if he fell and broke his leg and he's laying on top of the kid and can't get away? I mean, I just think anybody who plans a crime this intricate is going to have some kind of fail-safe.
Well,
I mean, it's argumentative, but it's I don't know. It's too much for one person. Possible, but unlikely. That's where I stand. Possible, but unlikely.
Well, and you hear people say that there was somebody on the inside that helped because no one else knew. I mean, that was a last-minute plan to be there on a Tuesday night, and they weren't normally there on a Tuesday night. What if he's watching the house and sees that they haven't left and is like, okay, here's my
haven't left or left?
They haven't left. That they haven't left, and sees the opportunity, knowing he's done surveillance. He knows that window doesn't work. He's like, hey, here's my chance. This house is easier to get into than the other one. I don't know. I mean, I would like to know, but I know there's experts that say, oh, he couldn't have done it alone. There's experts that say he did alone. Experts that say he did it alone, and there's experts that say he wasn't involved at all. So I guess my opinion really doesn't matter. I mean, I could go with any expert I want to support my opinion, but I don't know. I just I feel like he did it himself.
Well, I'm no expert, but I am kind of salty and negative, and I just don't think he pulls this off by himself. I just don't.
Have faith in people, B. Have faith.
I just don't. And he, you know, as some of the stuff, like the woman killing herself because the police come to question her again or whatever, and she drinks the silver polish or whatever, which, by the way, what a horrible way to go. But she may have inadvertently given him some help, or maybe she helped him on purpose. I mean, who knows? It's a high profile crime, and it's just so hard to nail down when it's something so, when you're dealing with the rock stars of the time. You didn't like my Denzel comparison, but I mean,
No, I love Denzel. I love Denzel.
Rock
but I just
stars
didn't
of the
know.
time.
I didn't know where that came from. Just Denzel.
Thinking of famous people.
Okay. Well, I am really interested to hear what other people think. After hearing our case, do your own research. There's an episode on PBS Nova, and it's got John Douglas, who's a former FBI behavioral science guy, big famous guy, and John Butts, who's a North Carolina retired chief medical examiner, and they kind of give some thoughts on what went on. Watch that because it's good. I made B watch it. And I want to hear what everybody thinks. I want to see who agrees with me and who agrees with Salty B, or who has their own opinion.
The smart money's on Salty B. We hope you enjoyed this week's case, and as always, we'll see you next week. We would like to hear your thoughts on this and all of our cases, and as always, you can reach us by email at truecrimeoutloud@gmail.com, Facebook and Instagram at True Crime Out Loud. Out Loud is 2 words, not one, and Twitter at TC Out Loud.
Photos, links, and sources for this case can be found on our website at www.truecrimeoutloud.com.